Okay, so welcome to the October 2023 proposal review call. These calls are, of course, a time, an opportunity for community members to come and discuss proposals that are live on the forum for that cycle, and also for the authors to discuss the proposal and answer any questions that the community might have before it goes up to vote in formal review in the following week. And then if that passes on to on-chain submission in the week thereafter. This month, we only have one proposal, and it's from Abby and I. So you'll get to listen to me talk a lot today. Abby, unfortunately, was unable to make it, but I will be sharing all of the details for this proposal. And on top of that, we have Ben here with us from Scopelift. Ben has been our main contact and partner at Scopelift to help us do all of this research into what upgrading our governance contracts would mean, what it would look like, what the options are. And he is also here to help answer questions and discuss some of the aspects of what a governance upgrade would look like here today. Yeah, the one proposal we have today, it is the RGP 17. It is to upgrade governance contracts from Compound Alpha to Open Zeppelin Governor. The Open Zeppelin Governor, so this proposal, was put forward by Abby and I. It's something that it's part of our bigger governance kind of initiative to upgrade our governance process, and also partially related to kind of how can we improve security, how can we improve sustainability of our governance process over time. And one of those things that came up was realizing while we were doing this is realizing how kind of limiting Compound Alpha has become as a governance contract, and also looking at all of the developments that have happened since we've launched our governance process in February of 2021, and just trying to think about if it would make sense to make a change. So over the last few months, as I mentioned, we've been talking with Ben from Scopelift and also the Tally team, who have been super helpful in our answering our questions and discussing kind of some of the options for upgrading the governance contracts. This proposal is purely it's a social proposal that's aim is to get consensus from the community around upgrading at all. So like, do we upgrade or do we stay with Alpha? If this proposal does pass, I'll go over a little bit more of like what the logistics and the timeline are towards the end of the proposal. But if this proposal does pass, the Scopelift team will go on to develop these contracts. And then once they're ready, we'll do an on-chain executable proposal to review and confirm the new contracts, and then if that passes, execute them on chain. So yeah, a little bit about the kind of background or the overview of why we want to do this. Governor Alpha was at the time the kind of battle-tested industry standard, but it has now slowly become over time a more outdated and very limiting form of governance contracts. It has also been surpassed now or succeeded by not only Compound Bravo, but now Open Zeppelin Governor. And the reason that, here, actually, I'm going to maybe switch the presentation quick so we can see this a little bit better. We can go through the proposal a little easier. And let's see. Okay, great. So yeah, this is just the proposal on the form. It's a little easier to go through. Yeah, so why and why would we be upgrading to governor? Why like skipping over Bravo and why is Alpha not good enough anymore? Alpha was designed as an immutable contract, meaning that you can't change any of the parameters around it, including like quorum or any like specific parameters that exist in the governance contract can't be changed without completely upgrading to another contract. So that in itself is very limiting, and meaning also that if we want to ever change any of these things, we'll have to do an upgrade like this anyway. So why not do an upgrade now, and also upgrade to contracts that are not immutable? So they're built in, the way the contracts are designed. They're designed to be able to be upgraded. That is with Bravo and Open Zeppelin Governor. There's security vulnerabilities within the Alpha contracts. I'll maybe ask Ben to add a little color or texture around what those are in a bit, in more detail. There's also, just as I was saying, a lot of limitations in composability of the contracts, ETH holding ability. The time lock can actually hold ETH itself. The granularity in voting, I think, is an interesting one as well. With the current Governor Alpha contracts, you can only vote yes or no on chain. With the newer versions of the contracts, you can do yes, no, abstain, and you can also leave some context on the votes, so you can like add a note on chain for why you vote a certain way or another, which I think is a cool feature as well. And in the new contracts, they're just more compatible with current and new tooling providers, which will become more important as we go forward and want to integrate new tools and to improve our governance process. And also just interoperability with other plugins and contracts as well, which we can chat about in a bit. But yeah, so upgrading to Open Zeppelin Governor, just as we started to learn more about it and talked more with Tally and Ben from Scopelift, it just started to make a lot more sense to move towards this and to explore it. So as I was saying, OZ Governor, it lets you describe, it has a lot more features and functionality than the current Alpha contract does. It lets you describe quorum as a function of the total supply instead of a fixed number of tokens, which is a really cool feature, which is something we've actually talked about before in the past. Of trying to have the quorum be based on how many tokens are actually available to be used to vote, rather than the total supply, which there's 50% of RAD tokens locked in the treasury, so they can't even be used to vote. So it's really, if you do the math, it really like makes the percentage of actual available voting power even less. So that would be a really cool feature on top of all of these other upgradable features that come with it naturally. OZ supports the flexible voting extension, which we noted here specifically because there are a lot of possibilities that would come with this voting extension and possibly other like contracts and extensions in the future that we don't necessarily know if we want to integrate right now. But again, it's just having the option to have the modularity going forward, which would be really great. And supports NFT voting in addition to ERC20 voting, and makes time lock delay optional. Again, all of these things aren't necessarily things that we would want to integrate now, or this is also completely up for discussion by the community. But we just wanted to highlight a few kind of like main points as to, in addition to the limitations of alpha, as to why Open Zeppelin Governor would be a cool choice to adopt into our governance contracts. In terms of legitimacy, credibility, and security, the ecosystem has, to a large extent, a lot of big players in the ecosystem have already chosen to adopt Open Zeppelin Governor, and it's now becoming the new industry standard, just as alpha was back in 2021 or early 2021, when we had launched our current governance contracts. Open Zeppelin Governor has kind of taken that place. And a lot of DAOs have started using it. A lot of kind of newer, smaller DAOs, it just has become the natural template that they just choose to use. And some of the larger DAOs, for example, ENS, and they launched their DAO on Open Zeppelin Governor, with Open Zeppelin Governor as well, and a few other DAOs as well have either used Open Zeppelin Governor or have used part of their contracts to build out or to customize their own governance, but it's the same core code base. So yeah, so that's also an important, that was an important piece for us, the ecosystem adoption reference, because battle tested, there's a reason that we chose alpha in the beginning, and it was because everybody was using it. It worked. There were like few issues with it. And now we definitely want to, this is a governance contract upgrade is such a huge deal. And we want to make sure, obviously, that the risks can be, mitigated to as what best as they can, but also to have proof in the ecosystem that these contracts work and they're working well for them. There's also been at least one audit of the OZ contracts that was released in 2021, August of 2021. And according to Scopelift, the OZ Governor is actually more maintained than Compound Bravo. I guess maybe that would be a question for Ben really quickly. I know OZ Governor contracts are like the newest and latest version of these contracts. Alpha and Bravo, they're actually not being maintained or developed or worked on at all anymore. Is that correct?
Yep, that's right. So Alpha and Bravo were both developed by Compound for Compound DAO. They were forked and, source forked and used by many DAOs, including Radworks with Alpha and others who also adopted Bravo when that upgrade occurred. And then what happened was Open Zeppelin sort of re-implemented Governor Bravo from the ground up and, had it audited, also, as you mentioned, sort of added additional features and modularity to it so that it could be easily extended and modified by developers who are customizing the contracts for their own DAOs. And since then, really, Open Zeppelin has become the industry standard. So that's what everybody sort of reaches toward. It's being maintained. It's being very carefully extended and pushed forward by Open Zeppelin. And of course, they're, in addition to having it audited externally themselves, they also continuously audit internally whenever changes or modifications are made to it. And so, on the other hand, the Compound Governor contracts, so Alpha and Bravo, they've basically just been stagnant since they were developed. They were adopted and used by Compound and some other DAOs, but because they were developed by Compound for the sake of Compound, once they were deployed and used, that was sort of it, right? They're serving their purpose for Compound, and they're not being actively maintained in any other way. So at this point, I think Open Zeppelin is very clearly sort of the ecosystem standard. They're sort of the standard bearer for governor contracts in the ecosystem moving forward. I wouldn't be surprised to see the governor contracts become sort of standardized officially at some point in the future with something like an EIP or something along those lines. But for the moment, it's sort of a de facto standard to use the Oz contracts.
Great. Yes. Thank you for confirming that. Yeah, so that's kind of why we made this jump, I'll call it, from alpha to Open Zeppelin governor. As we were going through this process, there were a few times where we were asked, like, why not Bravo? Why not do that middle step? As you've heard now from myself earlier and now from Ben, it's like the Open Zeppelin governor is just it's the successor of both of these contracts, so it's the newest and latest version of it, and it's the one that's being paid the most attention to and worked on the most by the industry. So yeah, that's we have a little section here as to, like, why not Bravo, but yeah, I think we've covered it. We've covered it enough here already. Why Scopelift? So who is Scopelift? Why would we like to work with them? Scopelift was introduced to us actually through the Tally team, who we know and love. And the Scopelift is just a small team of expert full stack EVM devs. And they have worked on a few other contract upgrades, most recently two very big ones. The Gitcoin contract upgrade, they also just upgraded to Open Zeppelin governor, and Pool Together also just upgraded to Open Zeppelin governor. So they definitely know what they're talking about. They've been through this now a few times, and we've built now a good relationship with them over the last few months, and on top of just the two most recent upgrades from Gitcoin and Pool Together, they've also worked with other big names in the space like Uniswap and Optimism, Endowment, Llama, Yield, a bunch of other folks. So yeah, I think the trust and the credibility of these folks, where the governance committee, Abby and I, are satisfied with. So yeah, we would be happy to work with them to upgrade our contracts. I'll also let Ben toot his own horn a little bit here in a minute when I'm done. But yeah, and so now to the logistics of it. As I was mentioning earlier, this is kind of like a multi-step process to approve this or get this upgrade to completion. This step or this proposal is purely a social proposal, so it will only require an off-chain vote, so it will only need to go through the formal review stage of our governance, so next week, because it is meant to purely gain consensus within the community around doing this upgrade in the first place. If the community agrees and says yes to this, the Scopelift team will go forward and develop these new contracts for us, run all of their tests, do all of the security checks that need to be done before they can be implemented. And once they are done, we will have another proposal that will be an executable proposal, meaning it will need to, in order to fully be passed, accepted, and for the contracts to be adopted, it will need to go through an on-chain vote in whatever governance cycle that will land in. So yeah, that's kind of like the timeline logistics or the process logistics for getting this the contract upgrade approved. Another fun little logistic piece I will mention here is that to pay for this upgrade, we're actually having Scopelift apply for a grant, which is also kind of a cool new way to experiment with how we can fund kind of governance projects and initiatives like this. So they'll be applying for a grant, which will fund the majority of their upfront development work. And then once the contracts are complete and they get brought to this executable proposal phase, the remainder of their fee, which they have outlined very nicely in their grant proposal, which you can also find on the forum under the grant section. It will be paid out in RAD. So not only are we getting to use the grants program in this to help fund this, but we also are getting to distribute RAD to some of the folks who will support and know our governance very intimately by the end of this process as well. So yeah, that's another exciting little logistics piece of that. And timeline wise, yeah, so if this passes the not September, October governance cycle, yeah, yeah, I'll fix that in the proposal. My apologies there. If it passes this cycle, scope of the team will start. Ben, you had mentioned before it will probably take around a month or 100 to 200 hours of testing, developing and testing for those contracts. Is that still correct?
Yep, that's right. And just to dig into that a little bit, like the overwhelming majority of that time is spent on the testing and simulation side of things, right? So the contracts that we're using, they're developed by OpenZeppelin. What we do is we sort of assemble the right contracts to make sure everything is compatible with your existing governance system. There's no new code that's written on our part in terms of the core governance contracts themselves, and that's on purpose because we don't want to write new code. We want to use audited, battle-tested, secure code. But then what we do is we spend a whole bunch of time writing a bunch of simulations and tests that are going to ensure the upgrade, one, goes smoothly, two, doesn't break anything if it's voted down, for example, or if we test a whole bunch of scenarios in terms of the upgrade itself. But then three, also ensure that the new governance system itself will function properly in all the different aspects that Radworks uses the governance system on chain afterwards. So we're simulating the proposal passing and executing properly, the upgrade functioning, but then also the new governance contracts themselves continuing to function in the specific contexts that the Radworks DAO uses their governance for. So all of that is tested end to end and simulated, and that's the majority of our time is doing that work.
Great. Yes. Thank you for the clarification. And sorry if I misspoke there.
No,
yes,
you didn't. I just wanted to give some color to it.
Yourselves, they're already developed. You're doing the testing, right, which is at the end of the day, like definitely a huge undertaking. And I think, yeah, is the spot where we really want to spend the most time and attention on to make sure that it's right. So yeah, I think that's all to share for now in terms of the basis of the proposal. Ben, is there anything you wanted to add to the context around the proposal before we jump into some of the questions that are already on the post? Or
I think you did a pretty good job describing it. Yeah, I'm not sure there's too much to add other than what we've covered. Yeah, so why don't we jump right to the questions?
Cool. Yeah, and the questions are definitely all related to things we've already talked about, but I think it's I think it would be good to highlight some of them just to have them also here on the recording going forward. So yeah, one of the topics of discussion that we had here initially when the proposal was posted was around like why does this make sense? Like why now? Like why do we need to upgrade now? What is the actual urgency behind needing to upgrade now, and why not later? Or why didn't we do it before? If it was so yeah, like and I think I'll take a swing at this first, but I would love for you to add the context around some context around this as well. Yeah, there's as I had mentioned earlier, there's our contracts are fine the way they are, but as we discussed earlier in the proposal, there's a lot of limitations. There are some, there's a lot of limitations. There's always risks involved, but it's not the main one being is the lack of being able to upgrade anything about these contracts, which could cause us a lot of problems in the future. And also it's not being maintained anymore. And upgrading now would provide us a lot of flexibility in the future. And why now is a good time is that we kind of have a low volume of proposals still. Our governance is generally pretty low volume, but now coming up to the end of the year and over the holidays, it's even lower volume. And so it would actually work out timing wise really well if this passes now for you folks to start doing your work to prepare the contract upgrade. And then we can have, that can be one of our first kind of proposals that goes through governance in the early in 2024. So that we can have this all ready to go for all of our 2024 governance season. So that is great, just on timing wise. But Ben, I would love for you to add any other context or points to this as well. It's like, what's the urgency around upgrading?
Yeah, so good question. So I think earlier we talked about some of the benefits of the upgrade, right? The additional features, things that are going to be nice for the DAO to have. Those don't necessarily give strong urgency, but they're good reasons to consider an upgrade. And then you have things like tooling, dropping support for alpha. At the end of the day, like the DAO space is growing. The number of DAOs that used Governor Alpha was relatively small, and especially if there were to be another bull market or something like that, relative to new DAOs that are going to be launching predominantly with Open Zeppelin Governor, the number of DAOs using Alpha is going to be minuscule, right? So most of the DAOs that were using it have upgraded or are in the process of it. And so I think there's a risk that at some point in the relatively near future, a lot of tooling is going to start dropping support for Alpha, or their tooling is going to be very minimal. It's not going to include the new features and developments and other things that they're going to have. And so that also provides some urgency, maybe again, not an enormous amount, but certainly some. Where I think there is the most urgency, and the reason why I think you want to do this sooner rather than later, is around security risk. Now, again, this isn't like a 5-alarm fire security risk. I don't want to oversell it, but I think it is serious enough that you want to take care of it before it becomes a 5-alarm fire risk, which it could in the future. And specifically what I'm talking about is this risk of a multi-block MEV attack of governance. So let me unpack that a little bit as briefly and as hopefully clearly as I can, what that's all about. So let's leave the MEV side of it aside for a minute and just talk about what like a potential, economic attack on the DAO could look like. So you could imagine someone going out and acquiring a bunch of RAD, buying RAD, not because they wanted to have a stake in the DAO and participate actively, but purely for the sake of putting forward some kind of proposal that we would call malicious. So maybe draining the treasury, or doing something to the protocol that is against the will of most of the community, et cetera, et cetera. But they go out and they acquire a bunch of RAD just to put that proposal forward, to vote on that proposal with the intention of immediately selling their RAD after doing that, right? So right now there's a bunch of obstacles that make that difficult, and one of them is that it's going to be costly to acquire all of that RAD. You're going to incur like the price of RAD is going to go up as you attempt to do that, how much liquidity is there, et cetera, et cetera. And then you're going to have to hold that DAO long enough, or hold that RAD long enough to put a proposal forward to the DAO. Once the proposal is live, you can vote on it, and then you can sell the RAD after that. But again, selling the RAD, you're going to incur a bunch of losses in doing that. And this whole process is going to be time consuming and costly for a user that does it, and there's going to be risk involved in doing it. And so if someone, for example, observes that this is going on, that's probably going to affect the RAD price. They're just taking on a lot of risk to try to execute this attack against the DAO. That changes if we get something that are called multi-block bundles in from these MEV service providers. So you've probably heard of things like Flashbots, etc. They have these things called bundles, where someone who wants to execute something for the sake of MEV submits these bundles to Flashbots, and the validators that create the blocks include those bundles in the blocks that they mine. Without paying the normal gas, they get compensated directly within the block. And as a result, these transactions never enter the normal mempool. So they're not visible on chain, or they're not visible in the mempool by regular validators. They're sent directly to these MEV validators that are going to include them. And they only include those transactions if they are successful. So the validators simulate the transactions, they make sure that they work, and they only include them if they're successful, because the validator doesn't get paid unless it's successful, because there's not normal gas being included in this transaction. Right now, bundles are limited to one block. So if you have a set of transactions that you want to execute, you submit those to the validator, and they're included in one block only if they're successful and only if the validator chooses to accept them and because of the compensation you're offering them. We expect, I mean, I think most in the ecosystem expect that at some point, these providers like Flashbots and others are going to start offering what's called multi-block MEV. In other words, you'll be able to submit a bundle that has transactions across at least 2 consecutive blocks and only gets mined if, again, the transactions are successful and if they're able to include them in 2 successive blocks, right? And so as a result, that greatly reduces the risk and the technical difficulty for executing the kind of economic attack we talked about before. Because what an attacker could do is, set up their bundle to go acquire a bunch of RAD in one block. If that acquiring of RAD is successful, submit the proposal in that same block. And then in the next block, vote on the proposal with the RAD that they still own and sell the RAD in that block. So that bundle of transactions would do all those steps. It would only get mined if it was successfully executed. It wouldn't be visible by anybody else on chain that this was taking place until it was done. And so what you could find yourself in the situation is one day you go to Tally and you find that there's a malicious proposal that's been submitted and voted on with a whole bunch of RAD, and the person who did that doesn't even own the RAD or have any exposure to RAD or to what they're doing moving forward. They've executed it pretty much risk-free with just the cost of the gas that they had to pay the miner for this multi-block MEV. And the reason that's possible today is because the existing contracts have a 1-block proposal delay. So what that means is you submit a proposal, and then 1 block later, you can start voting on that proposal. And so all that you need is multi-block MEV of 2 blocks in order to submit this, to do this maliciously with very, very low risk. And so what you want to avoid, you want to have a system that makes that more difficult. And what most DAOs have opted for is longer proposal delays. So if your proposal delay was not 2 blocks, but was even just a few blocks, this attack becomes much more difficult. If your proposal is something like 12 hours or 1 day, which is what most DAOs are choosing these days, then the attack becomes completely infeasible from a multi-block MEV perspective. And in fact, by making it longer, you make that economic attack more difficult because you're forcing these you're forcing a would-be attacker to hold the tokens for a longer period of time, forcing them to have exposure. Basically, it ups the economic costs of the would-be attack, even outside of the MEV context, but especially in the MEV context, it makes it impossible. So multi-block bundles don't exist today. I don't have any special information here, but I would imagine it's on the roadmap of most of these service providers. And it's something that, if you told me that one of them went live with it tomorrow, I wouldn't be shocked. If you told me that a year from now it still wasn't live, I wouldn't be shocked either. It really depends. There are some technical reasons why it's difficult to implement. And I'm not enough of, I'm not knowledgeable enough about the MEV world to know how one of these providers might prioritize this feature over other features that they might want to include for their users. But I think it's safe to say at some point, it will be possible to do multi-block MEV bundles, at which point this becomes a risk for the DAO. Now, again, not a 5-alarm fire, not something that's likely to happen tomorrow. Even if it did happen, there are short-term mitigations you could take to deal with it. But it's one of those things that you don't want to wait around until it becomes a problem and have to deal with external pressure. You want to make sure this upgrade is done correctly and properly tested and whatnot. And so I think that's the #1 reason to push an upgrade sooner rather than later. That explanation was a little longer than I would have liked. Sorry, it's a little bit complicated to explain. I hope it was clear. And Shelby, let me know if you have any questions about it.
Yeah, no, that was great actually, and that was something I meant to ask you about earlier, but I had forgotten. But to go into more detail around what that MEV attack risk would look like, or a little bit more detail around that. So that was Perfect, Ben. Thank you for that. But yeah, I agree with you in the framing of that as well. As like, it's not like a urgent, like red alarm right now, but if you have the opportunity to prepare in advance and to stay ahead of any potential future attacks or risks on that front, why not do it? So yeah, that's that thank you for going into a little bit more detail around the tooling piece and also the MEV attack as well. I actually wanted to circle back just really briefly quickly. When you were talking about tooling, are you referring to tooling like to platforms like Tally and Boardroom, like these kind of tools, or like what tools specifically have you seen or maybe heard or would be stop servicing the Governor Alpha, just to get a better idea of what.
Yeah, I think it's unlikely in the very short term that a platform like Tally would drop support for Alpha. What I can see happening is two things. One is they are not going to develop new features and capabilities for Governor Alpha, because again, it's already used by a minority of DAOs, and new DAOs are all adopting something. No new DAO is launching with Alpha today. So on a percentage basis, the number of their customers that use Governor Alpha is small and shrinking. It just makes no sense to have new features being prioritized for people using that. And so eventually, I think they will certainly sunset it. I don't think that's an immediate term urgent risk, but I think the more short term thing is that you're just not going to get new features from the providers that exist. I also think new tooling as it rolls out is not going to target Alpha at all. It's just not going to be something they consider. The market, the number of DAOs that are using it is too small, and again, not going to grow. So why would you spend engineering cycles building that out? And I'll give you one example. We worked on a tool called Seatbelt that was developed by Uniswap. We contributed a lot to that as part of a grant that we received for Uniswap. It's like a safety tool. So what it does is it runs a bunch of security checks on proposals when they go live. So the delegates can then review those security checks, and it just looks for like common and automatable. There's a bunch of automated tests that like look for common issues you could have with a proposal or security risk with the proposal, and ensures that they're not there. When we built that, and that was that was more than a year ago that we built that, but already at that point we said, well, we're not going to target Alpha. We're going to start with Bravo and Open Zeppelin and only support those two. If I were starting that project again today, I would actually say, don't even worry about Bravo. Let's just start with the Open Zeppelin Governor and focus our support on that. So like that's an example of a tool that we've already created that doesn't support Alpha. And I think as more tooling gets developed, no one's going to target Alpha for that. So you're not going to have your tooling that you're using today turn off anytime soon, but you're going to be missing out on a lot of really useful potential things that could roll out in the future.
Perfect. Great. Yeah. Thanks for highlighting that point again for me as well. So moving on then maybe to these final two questions or discussions that happened within the last few days here on the proposal. One of those questions was asking about the Timelock contract. I don't know if you want to briefly address that. I think it's not maybe something to spend too much time on, but because it doesn't really affect anything, but maybe it might be good just to discuss that a bit, Ben, if you don't mind.
Let me try to give like a 2-minute summary of that, right? Like the two core contracts that are related in the governance are the governor contract itself. That's the contract that has like overwhelmingly all of the logic involved in terms of how votes are processed, what quorum is, what thresholds are, et cetera, et cetera. How governance voting takes place, and what is considered a successful versus failed proposal. All of that logic exists in the governor. The second contract is the Timelock contract, and the only thing that the Timelock does is enforce a delay between when a proposal is successfully voted on and when it can actually execute on chain. And that's a security thing. It's to make sure that if there was some change of parameters that would impact users of the protocol or whatnot, they have time to react based on knowing that this proposal passed, but can't execute until some point in the future. So the Timelock actually also ends up being the treasury, because it's the contract that executes the transaction. So if you want to hold tokens, the Timelock is going to be the context that holds them. It's also the contract that's used in, like, let's say within the protocol, and Radworks does this, there's some specific role that you want governance to have, you're going to use the Timelock contract address. But the Timelock is actually a very simple contract itself. Again, all it does is enforce that delay. So what we're going to do, and what we did for other projects, is we're only going to upgrade the governor because that's where all of that logic and everything else lives. We're going to leave the Timelock in place, and the governor will be set up to interoperate with the existing Timelock. And that ensures that we don't have to go transferring a bunch of funds and upgrading a bunch of places where the governance is used. And that actually makes the upgrade a lot simpler and a lot more secure. So the way that it works out is actually quite nice, and it's the right balance between getting the new functionality and features that you want without putting funds at high risk and disturbing the protocol's operation and whatnot as well.
Great, thank you so much for going over that quick. That makes, I think it was good to have it also discussed out loud briefly here, even though you had answered it on the forum, just because I think that's maybe a small piece of governance contracts that folks might not know about. So yeah, great. Then we have one last question here. And yes, hi Yorgos. Thanks for joining here. We're going to get to your question right now, actually. So Yorgos had asked this really great question here, which I think is also something it's important to spend a little bit of time on, just to really discuss and go over. We kind of and it's about risk of like this is a huge, massive thing to do to upgrade your governance contracts. There's a lot of risk involved. It's all of the funding for the project is wrapped up in these contracts. So if anything were to go wrong, it could possibly, mean the end of Radworks. But as we were discussing, earlier in the call, there's also risks involved for not upgrading. But I think it might be good to discuss this specific point here. I know, Ben, you had also already given a few examples of kind of scope lifts experience and process around making sure that you can mitigate or reduce risk as much as possible, but maybe there's something you wanted to add here as well.
Yeah, I think the important thing to understand is like there is risk, and we want to be very clear about that and not try to hide the ball on that at all. And so like if you were to do something like, let's just use a like really boneheaded example of what could go wrong, right? Like let's say you upgraded to a new governor, and that governor had quorum set wrong, so that it was set to some high number that could never actually be achieved with the number of tokens that existed on chain. Well, guess what? That means you can never pass a proposal again, which means all the funds that are held can never be moved again, and you're screwed, right? Like they're locked. There's nothing you can do about that, right? And so if you do something dumb like that, you can lock all of the funds in the treasury, prevent maintenance of the protocol where governance is utilized for that, etc. Right? And so we want to be very, very clear about that and make sure that again it's well understood. It's also important to be clear about that so that the DAO understands why we spend as much time as we do writing all these simulations and tests, right? Because someone could say like, look, we're paying you guys to go write all these tests. Why don't we just YOLO the upgrade? You're just deploying some contracts and submitting a proposal. Like, why do all these simulations and tests and all this other stuff around there and spend all that time doing that when we could just upgrade it? And like, this is the reason why, right? Because if you make a mistake like that, and there are more nuanced mistakes you can make, that's just like a kind of trivial example. But if you screw something up, then it could go wrong. All of that said, because we do spend that time, because we're going to write, thousands of lines of simulations and tests, because we're going to update those tests to run against the on-chain code at each step of the process, right? So like we write the tests to simulate submitting the proposal and then all the steps after it. But then when the contract is actually deployed, we update them to use the actually deployed code. When the proposal is put on chain, we run the tests again with the actual live proposal. So we're constantly testing at every step of the phase to make sure that no bugs have been introduced anywhere. We're testing everything that can be considered, and it's all specific to the context of Radworks. It's not like some generalized test suite that we're just running that might miss some difference around Radworks DAO versus other DAOs. Nope, everything is tailored for Radworks. when you do all that, you can be very confident that the upgrade is going to succeed and it is going to work and be successful and allow continued operation of the DAO. And so that's why we spend the time doing it. That's what we did for Gitcoin and Pool together. Both of those DAOs have very large treasuries that were controlled, by governance, and therefore we're at stake with the upgrades. Both of those went smoothly, and they've continued to operate governance and execute proposals since then. And so I'm very confident that we can do the same for Radworks, but we want to be clear about the risk, and we want to be clear about why we're spending all the time to do what we do in order to ensure that we completely minimize those risks to the smallest level possible.
Yeah, great. Yorgos, do you have anything you want to ask?
No, I just wanted to echo this very same point, that I really appreciated the fact that it was there and it wasn't something that, the risk was stated very clearly. Because it's always like when you're pointing things like that out, it's always, kind of scary at the same time. But as you say, Ben, and I really appreciate that. It's just, making sure people who move forward with this understand there is, some risk there. And yeah, so I was very happy to see your reply. I haven't gone into detail and looked at the other examples yet, but thank you for the, prompt reply and extra information. And hearing you repeat it here, it's also very helpful.
Cool. Yeah. And, like I mentioned in the reply there, we would definitely welcome any technical contributors to the DAO or community members, reviewing our work and getting another set of eyes on it. We did that in both Pool Together and Gitcoin's case. They had, technically minded community members review everything that we did. And, that's great. That's good. Because we, more eyes, the better. There's no downside to it. So we definitely welcome all of that. But, and again, want to be clear about the risk, but I also want to be clear that it's risk that can be managed and mitigated. And that's why we have the processes in place that we do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That is great. And actually I love the idea of trying to involve or invite technically minded folks to get involved in the review process. We can maybe discuss a little bit on the forum how we want to do that exactly. But one initial idea I had is just whenever you folks get to a point where you're oh, it might be good for folks to review, you can post or write a comment on this proposal, and then folks can come in and join or contact you or reach out to your team, whatever the process would be, so that they're able to do that. But yeah, that's yep. I love that idea, and I think it would be a cool thing to invite folks to do as well. 100%. But yeah, we can discuss a little bit more on the forum of what that can look like.
Yep.
Great. Good. So Yorgos, do you have any other questions?
Not really, no. And I joined late. I was in another call, so I missed the beginning as well. So I'm good. I'm good.
Okay, great. Yeah. Cool. Well, yeah, I guess that's all we have then for today. Just a quick recap. Again, this is a social proposal just to gain community consensus around doing this upgrade. We have a lot of really great points and information, not only in this proposal, but also in Scopelift's grant proposal, which again is also on the forum. And I would recommend going to check that out as well. I'll include both links to this proposal and their grants proposal in the recording of this video for folks to reference more easily and find more easily. Yeah, I think we've seen we've discussed today a lot of points on safety and security, and arguments for why doing this upgrade would be important for both of those, but also in the context of modularity and flexibility and adaptability of our governance going forward. So yeah, if there's no other questions, and then I think we will close it out for today. Thank you again so much to Ben from Scopelift for being here and adding a lot of really great context and answering questions around the proposal. And yeah, if you have any other further questions or comments about the proposal, feel free to drop a note on the proposal itself. And yeah, this proposal will move into formal review on Monday of this coming week. So you'll be able to vote on it from starting Monday next week until the following Monday.
Very cool.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for having me and allowing me to ramble on here, and looking forward to hopefully working with the Radworks DAO to get your upgrade done.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. And thanks, Jorgos, for joining. Have a good day, everyone. See you later.